Hello world. So have you ever wondered how you can increase your customer base? Well, customers are just users whom you can communicate with effectively. This is where internationalization plays a key role. The more users you can communicate with, the easier it will be for you to convert them into actual customers. This sounds really interesting to implement, and without further ado, let's get started. Before we get started, we will need to install these libraries. These two are what we will be using for the internationalization, but this one will be required for the navigation between the different screens. And you can find the links in the description below. Once you finish installing, we can proceed on to the next step. Now that you have finished installing the required libraries, to use internationalization, we need to first configure the library and then introduce it to the React application. To do this, we will first create a configuration file which we call internationalization.config.ts. You can name it however you see fit, but in our case, this is the name we will be going with. First things first, we will create a resources object where our translations will be added. Notice that we import the various translations that we have using their shortcodes right here, and then we are going to add these shortcodes into the resources object so that each and every shortcode will reference the data that is contained in each and every translation file. So if we take a look, for example, at this English.json, we see it has this format, and if we take a look at Arabic.json, we see it has this format. The important thing to note is that the translation key here is what encloses data in this file. After that, we need to configure our internationalization library. We begin by adding this line here, and then we add this piece of code. So what does this piece of code actually do? What it does is that it passes in the init React internationalization next as a plugin into internationalization. Then it will initialize by simply passing in an object that we have specified right here. And this object, it has our resources that we mentioned a while back. Then it has the initial default language. Then it has another additional configuration here, which is called interpolation. So what does this actually do? What it does is that it simply configures whether we want to escape values when we are inserting values dynamically into translations. For example, you may want to display hello Ben, hello username in different locales. So the escape value you see right here, all it does is that it's used to make sure that we don't run unsafe code. By default, React escapes the cross-site scripting attacks. That's why it's set to false right here. So if for some reason you get this error, the fix for it is really easy and quick. All you need to do is to simply install this library and then import it in your configuration file, possibly at the top. So it will fix that error for you. And with that, let's proceed. So last but not least, in this file, we simply export internationalization, and this will make it possible for this library to be introduced into our application later on. Lastly, to wrap up on the configuration part of things, let's see how all these translation files are actually created. Always remember, you need to have that base file, and it is from this base file that the other files can be created. In our case, English is the base file. So let's copy all this, and then in your browser, simply go to this website, and then in the left input field, paste in the content that you have just copied, and then you specify the source language as you have been instructed here. Then you specify the target language, okay? And then simply click on this button. So when you click on it, you should be able to see the translated version of your base language, and that is the Arabic version. So if we want, for example, Swahili, all you need to do is to simply change the code to our target language, and then we simply convert it, and we should get the Swahili version of our base language. And if you want to use this, copy all the content, go back to your application, create a new file, call it swahili.json, paste the content inside here, and then add it in your list of resources. Okay, all we need to do is to simply duplicate that, and then we just change the source to be Swahili, and then right here we simply add Swahili and add Swahili to our list of drop-down languages in our language selector component right here. So all we need to do is to say here is Swahili and then Swahili. Then we should see Swahili here, but you notice it's appearing in a very weird way. So how do we fix this? We simply need to do this. We go back to our languages. Like for example, here we have our English, which is the base, and because we have just added Swahili, we need to add Swahili also in our translations. And then for the long language, we need to also add Swahili here. Then because we have changed something, we just copy everything. But if you want to make your life easier, simply copy what has changed, okay? But let's just copy everything for the sake of the tutorial. And we go back here, we paste it, then we convert once again. And then we get the updated versions. We go back, this is the Swahili version. We simply paste it there. Then we should now see Swahili. But if we change to another language, for example, Spanish, because Spanish, the file for Spanish does not have the translated Swahili version, we should see the key value version. Okay, that is something to note. So always make sure that you counter check. You check and you recheck your translations before you actually publish your code. But notice that if we change to English, Swahili appears as Swahili. If we change to Swahili, everything is Swahili, and also it's Swahili right here. So that means for us to be able to fix this issue in both Arabic and in Spanish, all we need to do is simply this. We go back to our browser right here. We change this to Arabic. We convert it. We copy everything here because now we have our Swahili version in Arabic. Okay. Then we go back here. We go to Arabic. We paste it right here. We do the same for Spanish. We copy everything. We simply paste it here. And that should be it. Now, when we change to Arabic, we should be able to see the Swahili name for Arabic. I challenge you to try the same for another language, maybe Portuguese, maybe German. And hopefully you can learn how to do this on your own. So now it's time to start using internationalization in our screens. One thing you have to know is that React internationalization provides a number of ways that you can achieve translation, but for our case, we will use the translation hook which is provided by React internationalization. However, feel free to pick the option you feel works best for you. So beginning with the home screen, we see that the default UI language we have is English, and we see that the default is also English in the profile component. Now let's change this language from English to Arabic, and we should see the change is also persisted in the home component. Now you may wonder how this was possible. Well, the beauty of using internationalization and internationalization next is that when we configured internationalization at the start, we made it possible to pass an instance of the internationalization. And if you recall, we had something like this right here. This section here is what will make this change propagate to all the components via the context API. So with that in mind, let's take a quick look at how our language picker component works. We will not delve into the intricate details of the appearance of this component, but we'll focus on the logic behind how changing the language works. So this is our language selector component. There is nothing much going on here, but let's just mention some key points. The first thing that you see here is the interface definition that has a key for identifying the languages, and it also has a label, which is what we are displaying here on the UI. So each and every language will have a key, for example, the code, and we see it here in the list of supported languages. So for example, English, the key for English is EN. And the label will be a key that points to a given translation in the translation files. The next thing is the hooks. We are going to use translation hook, which we have imported from React internationalization next. And what I want you to note is this part here. The first thing we are going to do is we are reassigning the property T to translate, and we will see why later on. And also we are picking two properties from internationalization. So we are going to have language here, reference to as current language, and also change language, reference to as set language. And the reason for this is that in as much as we have change language and language here, we will later on be adding our own hook, and our own hook will have its own pattern inside. So that's why we are just renaming change language to set language and also language to current language. So what this is that it's just object destructuring, whereby we are destructuring and then we are assigning a given constant. Okay. And then we have this internal state, which is simply toggling on and off. So that's what makes it possible for us to display this language selector view. Then we have on language change. So when I change a language here, this handler will be called, and then we simply compare if the language has changed. Then we actually call set language, and also we set show picker to false. Okay, when we have actually selected. So that's what's happening when we do that. All right. Okay. Now with the translate method in place, we simply call it and pass in the key that maps onto a value in our translation files like this. So here, for example, in the header part, we are passing in header.languageSelector.shortcode, all right? Then we are concatenating it with the current language, and this current language is a language that we have actually picked from UseTranslationUtility. Then for the display part in the drop-down list that we have here, we also call translate. Then we pass in the label, and also you recall at the top, we defined our header labels like this: header.languageSelector.long. The language label. And the same also applies to home component and profile component, where we are simply calling the translate method from UseTranslation like this. And then in profile component, we are doing the same, where we simply call the translate method and we pass in the key that we want to translate. So we see that for a translation to happen, we keep calling UseTranslate in multiple places in the application. This can be a problem because we are duplicating this hook, and if we decide to switch to a different library down the line, it will be really problematic for us. So how do we get around this? We create a translation hook that will be used in all places of our application, and it is what will abstract the specific translation library and the specific translation logic that we are going to be using. To do this, we will begin by creating a new folder in our shared folder. If you don't have a shared folder already, simply create it. And because this logic will be used in so many places in the application, just create the shared folder, then add into it a folder called utilities, because this hook that we are creating will be more of a utility function. Then you can prepend this utility file with use so that you can actually know this is a hook. Now with the file created, we simply start by exporting a constant, and remember, because this is a hook, it should start with use. Then first of all, we import use translation from React Internationalization, because as you recall, we said we are going to be abstracting the translation library that we are going to use. Then inside this use translation utility, we simply define our translation hook like this. So now we have access to translation. And lastly, we return something from this use translation utility. And the things we are going to return are going to be keys that are inside this object. So the first property here is the set language. This will be a function that simply changes the language to the new language that we have provided. Then we have a translate method that will receive a translation key. You remember our translation keys? Then this key that we receive is what we will pass inside the translation function that we have picked from use translation, which we have imported from React Internationalization next. Then we have the current language. This is what will tell us is maybe, for example, English the active language, is Arabic the active language, and so forth and so forth. Now our use translation utility hook is ready for use. Let's start adding it to our existing screens as well as the header. So starting with the header, this is the part that we only need to change. This is what we were using before. And because we already defined these constants that we are using here so that they could later on be used with our custom translation hook, all we need to do is to simply replace this line And here the reason we are getting an error is because current language is a function. So that means we simply need to call it here, and then that error should be solved. And then we have this translate error. So all we need to do is to simply import the translate function from our UseTranslationUtility hook. And then also we proceed here at the bottom. We need to also call this because it's a function. We save it as well. And also we need to update it right here. And with that, everything should work as it was working before. So we see we can simply change our language and it will be reflected and propagated everywhere. So now let's make this similar change in our home component as well as our profile component. So for our home component, all you need to do is to change that part there, and then we call our utility hook, and then we can remove this. And if we save it, everything should be okay. Then for the profile component, the logic is the same. We simply remove this, and then we call our utility hook, and then we can comfortably remove that part. And with that, everything should be working as it was working before. So if we open our profile, we see that everything is also connecting as it was connecting before. If we go back to our home component, everything is connecting as it was connecting before. As we wrap up this session, you can see how easy it was for you to add internationalization support to your React Native application. Just a recap, we ended up creating our custom use translation utility hook, then we added it in all parts of our application. This makes it easy for you to maintain your code base down the line should you need to change the translation library that you are using. Now, what you have learned here, go further and teach others that you may grow together. And with that, until the next one.